Well, let's go back now to the news of Saudi Arabia cutting oil production and other OPEC member countries extending existing cuts. Let's talk to Christof Ruehl, who's from the Centre on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Good to speak to you, Christof. So what's behind this decision from the OPEC Plus group to extend the existing output cuts into next year?
Good afternoon. I'm sorry, but I have to take a little bit issue with your man in New York here. I don't think there's any kind of big conspiracy theory, much less one between Iran and Saudi Arabia against the US. Behind that decision, what is behind that decision is an oil price which has declined a lot and which was sort of running at $120 when Russia invaded Ukraine and everybody was worried, and which before this decision was made was down below 70. And Saudi Arabia has a lot of big projects which they want to do, for better or worse, and big white elephants, some people say. But they do need an oil price in the 80s, or at least above 80, to not have a budget deficit. And what's behind this decision is frankly only the attempt, what they call stabilization, which in reality is just the attempt to keep the oil price above that threshold. I think that's the brief of the minister there.
So Saudi Arabia rather went their own way on this one, didn't they, cutting production. How will this decision have gone down within OPEC, within those other member countries?
Well, this is correct. You have to step back a little bit to see the full complexity of the problem. It's a really tricky situation for most of these producers involved. In the short term, there is this question, especially for Saudi Arabia, how do we get the oil price? How do we stop it from falling? If all indications in the market are that it is further under pressure if we don't do anything. That's where the cut comes from. But in the medium term, they have to get their own house in order, meaning OPEC, not OPEC Plus, but OPEC, the old members of the oil production cartel, because they operate on production quotas, and these production quotas are terribly dated. So you have a bunch of African countries who cannot even produce as much as they're allowed under the current quota system, simply because they haven't invested for a long time in their production capacity has gone down. And then you have other countries, most notably the United Arab Emirates, the rich neighbor of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, who have added capacity, and they are way below what they actually could produce. And so a year ago, they almost threatened to leave OPEC. They said, we need a higher quota. So the quotas, the baselines, need to be rearranged. That's the second step. And then the third very long-term proposition, of course, is what is going to happen to this hybrid organization. We have here OPEC, the old members of oil-producing countries, and then we have the plus, which is Russia and Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, a lot of countries in the vicinity of the former Soviet Union. Is this going to become one organization, or are they going to work together, or together sometimes? And so all these things had to be settled. And what happened here is that they did rearrange the quotas, at least for 24, which is one step in making some final decisions. And what the oil minister of Saudi Arabia called his lollipop or his sweetener was that they then did this this cut only of Saudi Arabia, this voluntary cut, sparing further cuts to all these countries who had to reduce their quotas even though they didn't really like it. That was his lollipop, and that's what this quote referred to. So they did the short-term thing, they cut, and only Saudi is bearing the costs of that. And they did start the medium-term thing to rearrange their quotas. On the longer-term thing, I think a lot will happen, what happens in Ukraine.
So I wanted to ask you about the oil price. Obviously, it's designed to push up the price of that. We have seen that happen. Will this keep them higher, though? And what does that mean for people like you and me, people buying petrol at the pump?
It probably will put a hold on it. Whether it will work or not depends on the extent to which these cuts are really implemented. I have no doubts the Saudis will implement the cuts, but if they do it only for 1 month, that translates into 100,000 barrels per day for the whole year, which is how these things are usually measured. So it's not very much. But even if they sustain it, it depends what other countries do, Iran, Venezuela, Guyana, Brazil, who all have, and not least the US, who have the potential to produce more. And what has happened already is that the high oil prices for a while after the Russian invasion were an inducement to reduce demand among many customers. So to see the problem the Saudis are facing if they continue going it alone, you have to just look back to the 1980s after the oil price shocks. Oil prices fell into their 20s, and Saudi Arabia frantically cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, trying to bring them back against falling global demand, until in the late 80s they finally gave up and just swamped the market, and then it took until the early 2000s until they came back. But now we're a very similar situation. Global economy not in good shape. Fed raising interest rates again. The Saudis going it alone, cutting, because nobody else really wants to join. The other countries are happy with the way they are. And the question is, can they stop the decline? My best guess is they will be able to stop the decline if we don't see a major economic recession.
Okay, Christof Ruehl from Columbia University, thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.